So let me begin with a question. There's no right or wrong. I'm just asking you. When you receive a new item, what is your approach toward the instructions? Or maybe directions, or maybe even an owner's manual? Surely you do appreciate not everyone has the same approach. There are some people who discard it without ever looking. In fact, it might be a gift that you have gotten for Christmas. And I know this was true in our household. Children would get a gift and open it up and, rip through the package, tear open the box. Instructions are still left attached to the box or thrown away with the wrappings. Others just look at it, lay it aside, without ever opening it up for any assistance, maybe with assembling or understanding the proper use of it. Others carefully read it before doing anything else. Now, I will tell you from personal experience, sometimes that will be done to the chagrin of others, maybe even irritation. Recently, my grandson got a box. He was 3 at the time, just shortly, not long ago, turned 4, but he's this big. His box was this big. All right, so he opens that thing up, and I'm looking at that and go, wow. So it was a Hot Wheels. They still do Hot Wheels. Hot Wheels with a dinosaur in the middle, and I'm thinking, oh, that's got to be fun to put together. So I was anticipating doing that. To my pleasant surprise, when I came back from work the following day, it was already done. And it seemed to be working, so they must have followed the directions, because I could only imagine what those look like. But then again, reading, we get a new game, and so we're sitting there at the dining room table, and the two older ones, they're 10th grade, 9th grade. The younger one, he's in 5th grade, and anyways, I open up, and I said, so how do you play though? I don't know. We'll figure it out, Papa. And I said, no. So we got to read the direction. No, Papa, don't do that. And so I'm sitting there reading, and it's very obvious no one's paying attention, because after a very careful enunciation of every point, every rule, they're looking at something and say, what's this for? What does that mean? So, like I said, some folks are irritated if you take the time to do it. I'm probably closer to the second group if you haven't figured that out. I think it's the wisest course to follow. However, not always flawless. Got another anecdotal incident a number of years back. This must be going back now close to 15 years. I think first grandson arrived, jungle gym. They were staying with us, got to get a jungle gym in the backyard. And so got one of those, and I don't know if you've ever looked inside of that box. There looked like to be 10,000 pieces. And anyways, my son happened to be home at the time. Now, he has an engineering background, right? So anyways, we get into this thing. First thing it tells us to do is make sure everything's there. And I'm thankful he's kind of, not falling far from the tree. He's kind of like me. So we took the time, we laid everything out, and everything seemed to be there. So I think the instructions said this should take 2 adults approximately 8 hours to complete. Well, we finished it in a month. Now, we didn't work on it every day, but every Saturday we were out there. One thing that required a little extra time is after we finished 2 or 3 steps, we realized, looking at the picture, that's not what our piece looks like. And we had done everything in reverse. So now you have to disassemble and start all over. I say all that because the jungle gym seemed to be right. We were left with a 6-foot piece of lumber that to this day is in my garage, and I have no idea where it belonged. See, we had already done an inventory, so we had everything. I don't know. My point is, people don't always have the same approach with regards to instructions, directions, even owner manuals. Now, those who more closely conform to that first group that have little regard for instructions, occasionally, after hours of huffing about due to unsuccessful attempts to construct what it was they were trying to construct or to get to work what it was they were trying to work, sometimes they have to go to the trash can, hunt down the instructions, and finally open them up. Please hear me. In the final analysis, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which group you belong to. I have no less of an opinion on you if you'll tell me you throw them away. I really don't. That's not going to change my opinion of you. But what about life? What about life? Kind of following the analogy, we might consider life as a gift that is given to us. And in receiving that gift, at some point in our mental growth and development, we're going to have to ponder in concept this same issue. What's going to be my approach, my attitude toward instructions, the directions, the owner's manual with regards to life? Now, it would be ideal, it certainly would be our hope, that the moment of decision for each one will come with some recognition of the one who is our Creator, who is the architect of life, so that they know where to look. As that heavenly scene depicts for us in Revelation chapter 2, the 24 elders prostrated before the throne of God, exclaiming this, "Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power." Listen to why. "For thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created." Or as the Hebrew writer says of Jesus, the second person of the Godhead, "For whom are all things, and by whom are all things." Or maybe as the Apostle Paul stood before those Grecian philosophers there on Mars Hill in ancient Athens, and he informed those idolaters, those secularists, of this about the God that they erected an idol to, entitled the unknown God. He says, "God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything. Seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things, he has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth," listen, "and has determined the time before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." Thankfully, our God graciously has included an owner's manual with the gift of life. It's His Word. And it does, as we would expect of an owner's manual, it does inform us, it instructs us of what this life is all about. It tells us why we are here and what we ought to be doing with this gift called life. So again, I ask you, what will be my attitude? What will be your approach to those divine directives? Now, you remember what I said before in the final analysis, it doesn't matter with regards to those other things? in the final analysis here, this is the only thing that matters. The answer you give to that question has eternal, everlasting consequences. And so that brings us back to a series of sermons that we just introduced. Didn't get much further into it than the introduction the last time we were together. Gave a handout to you, and so we're going to try to make this review as brief as possible so that we can get into the first point. But again, when we think about God's, as our creator and the architect of life, giving us an owner's manual, the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, really helps us appreciate maybe the two approaches that a person can have with regards to that owner's manual. The two approaches that we set forth with regards to other things that we might receive that are new to us, that are unknown to us. Again, you can discard it and try to do it on your own. Solomon sets forth that proposition. He says, under the sun, let's take God out of the picture. Let's throw away the owner's manual. Let's disregard the instructions and directions that came with life. Let's try to do it on our own. What was that like, Solomon? Much like what happens when you try to do it with other things. It proved meaningless. It was empty. It was vanity. But not only that, Solomon says it was frustrating. Again, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, he says, vanity of vanity, all is vanities. Over in chapter 2, as we looked at the last time we were together, here is Solomon talking about all of the wealth, all of the material possessions he owns, and he comes away and he says, I hated life. I hated it. That's far less than just meaninglessness. Now we're into misery, frustration. But on the other hand, what if we took the owner's manual? What if we allowed God, as our creator, as the architect of life, to instruct us what this life is all about? How we ought to live it? Would you agree with me that would be the wise course to follow? And that's how Solomon ends his experiment on the purpose of life. He says, here it is. Let me tell you the conclusion. It's brief. You don't need a lot of elaboration on it. Fear God. Keep His commandments. That is the whole duty of man. That's what life is all about. That's what the instruction manual will tell you to do. Fear God and keep His commandments. Now, as you see here, we have choose wisdom, and that will prevent misery. And if you failed to remember, this is taken from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, so I invite your attention over there, because there in chapter 8 and verse 6, at the end of the verse, it says, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. And as you see there in point 2 of the introduction, I believe this misery of which Solomon writes here is something that man brings upon himself. He does that by choosing to reject God's wisdom for living life. And that seems to be borne out in this context. It seems as though Solomon is contrasting wisdom with misery. Notice how it starts. Who is as a wise man, Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 1. Who understands the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face to shine. The boldness of his face will be changed. When you get down to verse 5, the end of that verse, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him. It appears as though Solomon is setting in opposition to one another. Wisdom, true wisdom, look to God, Again, the originator, the creator, the architect of life, wisely choose to follow his directives, instructions for what life is all about, that will bring a fulfilling, a contented, a gratifying life. But you throw away the owner's manual. You disregard the instructions. You choose to do it on your own, just figure it out like my grandchildren would do. Well, we'll just figure it out, Papa, as we go along. You try that approach about life. The result of misery. You're gonna come away discontented, frustrated, and again, miserable. The state of great unhappiness and emotional distress. And so I'm asking us to take that principle, choose wisdom to prevent misery, and take that and apply it to things that Solomon introduces to us here in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I hope it will be an insightful study. It was for me. So let's look at the first one. Choose wisdom. It will prevent misery if you are willing to accept authority. Accept authority. Look how he begins there, verse 2. I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleases him. Where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing. So what does Solomon propose? What does Solomon recommend? Choose wisdom. Be willing to accept authority, and that will help you to keep from introducing misery into your life. Let's explore that a bit. Now, first of all, again, we're talking about true wisdom. And where does true wisdom have its very foundation? You know, the Bible is succinctly clear on this matter, frequently affirms it. True wisdom begins by acknowledging and accepting the sovereign authority of God as our Creator. Friends, we could spend the rest of the time we have together looking at verses that affirm that, but just a sampling. What about Psalm 111, verse 10? It states it in those very words. The fear of the Lord, the psalmist says, is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. Did you see both aspects? You acknowledge God's right to exercise sovereign authority over all that he has created. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, how do you accept that? How do you appropriate that? How do you put that into practice? Then a good understanding have all they that do his commandments. You acknowledge it and you accept it. You appropriate it. You act on it. Solomon, this same inspired penman, would explain several times in the book of Proverbs this truth. The fear of the Lord is where true wisdom begins. You remember, that's what the book of Proverbs is all about. The first, 9 chapters is Solomon as a father sitting down with his children and saying, let me instruct you in wisdom. And you know, one of the first things he's going to say is chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Later on in Proverbs 15 and verse 33, listen to this. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Friends, humbly acknowledging, reverently submitting to the sovereign authority of our God, our Creator, is the cornerstone. It's the very foundation. It's the first principle for living a life characterized by wisdom. In our call to worship this morning, for those who are here, we We read from the book of Job, and Job finally gets an opportunity to speak with God, and what we read was God's, dialogue with Job, and that consisted mostly of Job being asked questions of God. But it's interesting, back in Job 28, Job has this monologue about wisdom. And obviously he was a man of great wisdom. God said to the devil, he says, have you considered him? There's no one like him. There's no one like Job. But here is Job in chapter 28, and Job's probing the question of where does wisdom come from? You remember that? It's interesting how he begins this. He talks about, we can find silver in the veins of the earth. We can dig down deep and find precious metals and buried in the core of the earth. We can do that. Then he asks, verse 12, but where shall wisdom be found? Where's the place of understanding? And he gives a lot of negative answers. He says, man can't buy it. Man can't find it. Death and destruction have been asked, where is wisdom? And they said, we've heard of it, but we don't know where to find it. And so he asks again, verse 20, whence then cometh wisdom? Where's the place of understanding? It's hid from the eyes of all living, kept closed from the fowls of the air. Verse 23, listen to it. God understands the way thereof. He knows the place thereof. Now listen to what Job says God says to man in light of that. The last verse of chapter 28, verse 28, and unto man God says, behold, the fear of the Lord, listen to it, that is wisdom. Now notice what he doesn't, it's not the beginning, it's not the foundation. He says that is wisdom. You capture this concept. You embrace this, and you're wise. Reverentially fear God, His sovereign authority, because of His being the Creator. He's the architect of life. Now again, doesn't this very well harmonize with the basis of Solomon's conclusion at the end of this book of what life is all about? Remember his conclusion? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments. That is the whole duty of man. That's true wisdom. That's where it begins. Accepting the sovereign authority of God. But quickly we have to make this transition. Growing out of that initial recognition should then come accepting all established authority. You know why? Because it is ordained of God. The one to whom we have already, as the very first step toward living wisely, have accepted the sovereign authority of God, then God says, okay, now since you have accepted my authority, please understand, I have given delegated authority to others. And if you're wise, you will accept that. Friends, this is that wonderful truth affirmed in Romans chapter 12. You want to turn over there, Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. Listen to verses 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Now again, he's going to make an application of that. But before you run down to chapter 13, verse 3, before you get there, listen to the rest of verses 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power. You can substitute authority in there. There is no authority but of God. The powers, the authorities that be are ordained of God. Now, I hope you paid attention to verse 1, but if you didn't, certainly listen to verse 2. Whoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation, condemnation. You understand the significance of that? This inspired penman is telling us that a person's attitude toward and willingness to submit themselves to those God-ordained powers or authorities, whatever they are, Paul says that is tantamount to, that is representative of one's attitude toward and willingness to subject themselves to God Himself. And he concludes verse 2 by telling us God's judgment of an individual will take into account this area of their lives. Again, those that resist will receive to themselves damnation. Again, put that in the overall context of God judging man in that final day. Mike Brandt's going to come before Him, and God's going to say, through the person of Jesus the judge, He's going to say, did you subject yourselves to all ordained authority that I have established on earth? Now, the first one that he's going to make application to here in Romans chapter 13, with regards to this principle of subjection to the divinely delegated powers, is governmental authority. That's the first one. That's the only one he's going to bring up here. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good. You'll have the praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon them that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. First application, governmental authority. Why does it exist in whatever form it does exist? Because God has ordained that man be structured in a society under governmental rule. That's God's ordained plan. And so those rulers, have His delegated authority to act in that position. What is our responsibility? Submit. Subject ourselves. Understanding that when we do that, we demonstrate to God we're accepting His ordained authority. Resist that, and God understands that you wouldn't resist me. You would resist me because you're not accepting my ordained authority. Now, go back to Ecclesiastes quickly. That's where our text is found. And I believe you can see clearly that's the application of this principle of accepting authority here in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. In fact, I believe you will see many parallel sentiments to what we just read in Romans chapter 13. Look, for instance, in verse 2, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment. Notice, and that in regard to the oath of God, conscience sake. Conscience sake. Look at verse 4, the beginning of that. Where the word of the king is, there is power, there's authority. And that's what Paul said back in Romans. If you do good, you don't have to be afraid of the power. And then also look at verse 5. Whosoever keeps the commandment shall feel no evil thing. Now again, Romans 13, Ecclesiastes chapter 8, the application is governmental authority. But please understand, that's just one application. See, the wisdom, choosing wisdom, the wisdom of accepting authority applies to every realm, every social structure wherein God has ordained such delegated authority to promote orderliness. And William, as I thought about it, the question came to my mind, what realm or social structure has God not ordained? Such the concept of authority. What about the home? Yes. What about education? Yes. What about the workplace? Yes. What about the community? Yes. What about the church? Yeah. Where's the realm? Where's the social structure that God, as the architect of life, has put in place wherein He has not ordained this structure of authority with those under it submitting to it? I couldn't think of one. If you can, please let me know. But I couldn't think of one. Maybe friendship. Maybe friendship. And even if it's friendship, I would take you to Ephesians 5:21. Let everyone be subject one to another. I don't know. But I'm just saying maybe we don't see an authority versus a subject. I couldn't think of one. And I believe, were we willing to take the time, we could ascertain from God's Word His wise counsel to willingly, humbly submit to authority in all of these realms, all of these social structures, with the promise that if you do that, it'll go well. And the warning that if you don't, you're going to introduce misery into your life. Again, just a very small sampling. What about the home? Ephesians 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is right. Honor your father and mother. Listen to it, which is the first commandment with promise. What's the promise? That it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. What about the workplace? By application in that social structure of the first century, servant, slave, Colossians 3:22, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. What is the foundation of all of this submission? It is fear of God, reverential awe for God who ordained it. Whatever you do it heartily as to the Lord, not as to men. Knowing, listen to it, knowing that of the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done. And there is no respect of persons. What about the church? Hebrews 13 and verse 7, obey them that hold the rule over you. Submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give an account. Listen to it, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. You want to avoid misery in your life? God, the architect of life, says here's one of the first things you need to do. You need to be willing to accept authority in every aspect of your life, every realm. In fact, I don't know, but it kind of becomes apparent to me. From God's ordering and structuring earthly relationships to this uniform way, authority requiring subjection, it would appear to me that God is trying to help us understand that part of His design for this life is for us to cultivate a spirit of submission. Why else would God do that? We can't see Him. Again, we're supposed to reverently subject ourselves to Him as sovereign over all heaven and earth and all of His creation. But we can't see Him. So what does He do? He gives us a visual. He gives us a construct in this earthly sojourn so that we understand what that looks like, what that demands. Those to whom He has delegated authority, you subject yourself to them, knowing that they have that authority only because of me. Now, obviously, this begins at home, right? Parents, this begins with children. And in that first classroom, parents should be instilling in their children respect for all authority. Now, the first is parental. And we know how that works. I mean, these kids are, they're young. Sometimes that trying to impress upon them that, there's wisdom in accepting authority, because if you don't obey me, there's consequences. Again, I told you about that little 4-year-old. He spends most of his time around Meemaw. She runs a daycare, and so she's there every day with him. And I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I'm walking in the house after work, my daughter's house, and there's Gavin in the corner. I said, "What's going on, Gavin?" Meemaw told me to go in the corner. I said, "Well, why?" "I don't know." I said, "You don't know? Were you good?" "Yes." So then I got to get the scoop from Meemaw. What's going on? It's not just the corner. She uses a wooden spoon on his bottom, and so every once in a while I hear pop, and he's gotten to where he doesn't even cry anymore. But, I understand. He knows what's going on. All of this is an effort for parents to try to help children in those infant years with this fundamental concept. You need to be willing to obey those who are over you. That starts with parental. And you know what? It can't stop at parental. Then we need to teach our children. When you go in the classroom, that teacher of yours, you need to submit. You need to surrender. You never talk back. You are respectful. You do whatever they ask you to do. And if you think it's wrong, you come home and tell us. It goes to police officers. So when they are in the car and you're stopped for speeding, what are you going to do? You're going to argue? You're going to resist? You're going to try to set the proper example and then tell them and said, "Papa was wrong. That's wrong. I went beyond the speed limit. I should be respecting that." And that officer of the law, he was doing his job. He was stopping me and correcting me. Now, maybe he gave me a warning. Maybe he gave me a fine. Maybe he gave me a ticket. That's a great teaching opportunity. Community leaders, you run into your mayor, you run into your city councilman, and introduce them. Tell them this is a person that's making decisions for our community. We need to respect them and respect their decisions. I'm way past, so I got to stop, and I'll have to hold this over till next week. Friends, if we fail to do that in that first classroom as parents, well then, what happens is misery. We're going to be introducing misery into their lives. It'll take many forms. I'd encourage us to think seriously. That's the first bit of counsel that Solomon gives us. If you want to prevent misery from being introduced into your life, invited into your life, wisely choose to accept authority. It begins with God's authority. But again, He's the only one who has authority, ultimately. And so whoever else has authority, it's because of Him. Now, obviously, we might ask, well, what about when those who are in authority are not doing right? Lord willing, next week we'll address that. Interestingly, Solomon addresses that. He holds out that possibility. So we'll talk about our responsibilities in such a scenario. Thank you for your kind attention. Song of invitation is, have thine own way, Lord. Can you appreciate that now in light of our study? What are you going to do with the owner's manual? When you get to a point in life and realize, hey, I've got to ask myself, why am I here? What's this gift of life all about? What am I supposed to be using this for? And will I be held accountable one day? Well, the giver of life, thankfully, graciously, has given us the owner's manual and answered those questions. And hopefully from our study this morning, we understand that the attitude, true wisdom demands the attitude that says, have thine own way, Lord. Have thine own way.